He was looking across the lake and he saw the funnel come down and just take the houses, and he said, "There's the tornado, everyone in the basement." So all these people go running down into Dave's basement, and his sister's dragging me under the pool table, and his mom is standing at the window watching it, and I just kept thinking, oh, I wish I was standing at that window. I would love to watch this, you know, and here I am under a table. So in the confusion, we had forgotten that there were teenagers and maybe 10, 11, 12-year-olds that were playing down in the little cottage that was closer to the lake. And they told us later that they were playing down there, and they heard a loud noise, and I think they even saw Lauren Akers, you know, get hit. So they said, well, we better lay on the floor. So they laid on the floor, and then they thought, no, I don't think this is any place for us. We got to run for the house. So they ran up to the house, and by the time they got to the door, that cottage was gone, just gone. So, and that's another thing you always think of in a tornado like that. Okay, do you open the doors or do you shut the doors? Do you open the windows or do you shut the windows? And I'm not sure to this day what is it that you do. But that was, and it did take that little cottage, but it didn't come up to the main house. It swerved off and got some houses that were next to Dave. So I called my mother immediately and said, I'm fine, you know, and fine, what do you mean, you know? Because a lot of people didn't know that tornadoes had hit in different places. My dad was the manager of the Orono liquor store, and Jack Eckery called him and said, I think we need to have a drink. I think we're out of business, because Eckery's and the Orono liquor store, of course, were damaged. Also, in the local paper, there was a picture of my dad and another clerk kind of with their heads peeking out of the walk-in cooler. You know, like that's where they were staying when the tornado. But that was not true. My dad wasn't even there. It was just kind of a fun thing to do for the paper. So you can't always believe everything that's in the paper.
Hi, Shirley Romness, and we lived on Cooks Bay, and when just before it started, we had been at Rosetta. We had taken our son over for his guitar lesson, and then our neighbor, Marianne Olson, had said, is it okay if Dave comes over to my daughter's house? Sue Ann was living over in Deep Haven. So we said, oh, fine. So off they went. We almost stopped someplace for dinner on the way home, but then the weather didn't look very good, so we decided, no, we better go home. And, you know, when you live on the lake, you worry about your boats, so it got worse and worse. And when it came through Cooks Bay, we could actually, some of us that were there on those houses, we could see the bottom of the lake because it just came right through. And Tonka Toys had a full shift of workers. And if it had not turned in the middle of Cooks Bay and gone over the island, it could have hit Tonka Toys, and that would have been a disaster. But it wasn't long after that why Ken left, and it was supposed to be his 40th birthday on Saturday, and we were to go to Don Lobdell's on the island for a surprise birthday party. Well, of course, we couldn't go there, so it was changed over to Carlson's, and he had been up for about 2 days, and he was not about to go to any party. He didn't. And I had a hard time talking him into, I said, oh, there's some people coming from Minneapolis, and I think you ought to go. And so he finally did, but it was not, but he said, you know, he'd been over on the island, and he said, you know, how you do what you have to do, like Jerry said, but you don't, nobody knew where wires were down, and they were walking around over there, so it was a kind of a dangerous place. Fortunately, nobody was hurt doing any of that work. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Joy Grundine, and my parents were Luther and Hazel Anderson, and they had Twin Birch Nursing Home at that time, but it was a small nursing home. And I remember we lived next door to the nursing home, and again, it was ominous weather, and my mother had laundry on the line, so she decided she better go in or go outside and take the laundry down. And she walked in and she said, it's almost like I hear a freight train coming. Well, my dad was sitting in his easy chair, his favorite, you know, dad chair. And when he heard her say, I think I hear a freight train, he put the newspaper down. And then we just hit the basement. But again, we were very fortunate at the nursing home where it did just jump over and we just had debris and nothing. very drastic. But my dad was a member of the Spring Park Council at that time, so he was called right away to come out and kind of help in Spring Park, again, to direct traffic and not to allow, people from Minneapolis out. And I can remember he came home, and I see Jim Bedell over there, and I remember one of the things that my dad just felt so bad about was the Shervin family, how they had lost their home, and he had lost his school buses, and he had lost his car lot dealership, and can remember him feeling, very bad for the Shervins, that they had lost almost everything in that. But I also remembered school the next day, being we didn't have any damage. I had to go to school. There was no reason for me not to go to school. And the school was just very quiet and very surreal, and there was hardly anyone there, and it was just kind of a day of doing nothing because so many people had been affected. And again, as Jerry said, there wasn't really any emergency preparation at that time or thinking about disasters. And it was shortly thereafter that the fire department came over to the nursing home, and then we did have a drill, a disaster drill or a fire drill or a what if scenario where we had all the residents partake in that so that we could be a little bit more heads up if something like that should ever happen again. And I mentioned to Ramona, the one thing I remember about the fire department was that the women got busy and started to cook right away. The women's auxiliary just went in and started to cook to feed those firemen that were working around the clock.
You have someone else that would like to share their story? Okay, we'll go back in the other corner here.
I'm Jim Bedell, and I, at the time, was working for my father-in-law, had a Chevrolet agency in Navarre, and I had gone back that late afternoon to deliver a new car, and I had my 4-year-old son with me, and the skies were, it was storming, and then it just got real calm, and it was kind of a green cast to the day, and I was looking out the front door. The guy that picked up this new car had left, and I called over a friend of mine who was working at the gas station at Herb Ross's next door, Tom Jurdy, and I said, "You better get over here." I said, "I don't know what's going on, but something's going to happen." And he came over, and we started, it was a small dealership. There's 2 cars in the showroom, and then there's a parts room, and we started actually running from the front to the back. By the time we got through the parts department, the showroom in the front was coming down. And the building was collapsing. And when we got to down at the bottom of the stairs, all the parts bins from the main level were falling down the stairs against us. And I'd only been down this basement a few times. It was just used for storage. And so we were trying to figure out how to get out. And I knew there was windows along the side, basement windows, that we had to get up, and there was parts bins all along. So we were lighting matches trying to see where we were. But meanwhile, there's cleaning solvents from Ronnie's Cleaners next door and from things from the parts room in 55-gallon drums. And we're smelling, it's getting kind of a strong smell. So we decided we better not light any more matches. And finally we pulled a lot of the bins away and found this window. And it was like a high basement window. So it was total darkness, and we were just feeling frantically to get out, and we made it out, and we went across the street. The whole town, the whole corner was just, there was cars stacked on top of each other. My father-in-law also owned, I think, 6 school buses, and some of them were down in the swamp, some of them were on a pile. But we walked across the street to the Navarre Inn, and that was the other side of the street was fine for the most part. And we walked in, and the place was fairly full, but most of the people just sat there just drinking. They didn't even really look out to see what was going, that the whole other side of the street was gone. So it was kind of an interesting study. So anyway, that's my tornado story. Well, my brother-in-law had just purchased the Maple drive-in about, I think, a week earlier, and there was probably 5 or 6 employees there, and they all just kind of huddled in the middle, and the thing really just blew away around them, and nobody, as I recall, didn't have a scratch on them. So.
Oh, okay. I was working at that 66 a pure oil station on 19 and 15 when that came through, and I was a mechanic there. I was 20 years old. I was taking a customer's car back, and it was one of these Buick station wagons, very heavy car. And on the way back, things started getting very strange out there, and the winds would actually blow this heavy car off the road, and I was trying to get back on the road sort of by braille. Then everything got dark, and I could see the lights in the VAR went out, and this is a bad deal. Of course, the radio's going and talking about tornadoes, so I know now I'm in a tornado. Can't see where I'm going, and a power line comes across the windshield. So I thought I'd pull that over the car. That was okay. The interesting thing is I got back into Navarre and pulled into behind the Navarre Bank. Thought I was safe. That was when your dealership was blowing down. And I heard somebody dive down the stairs later and just missed the building coming down on them. And the drive-in, by the way, was collapsed on the people, and I ran from the car over there because they were screaming, wanted help. And I said, anybody hurt? And they said, no, everybody's fine, but they were afraid they didn't know what the power situation was. Well, all the lights were off. I figured, I think you can crawl out of there if you want, but I'll send somebody. And then we went over to the bar and had a beer. Everything was coming apart. But one of the interesting things about, one of the things that stuck in my mind is all this violence and the intersection was cars all over, just like toys, just like some kid just took the whole thing and threw it up. But there was a 58 Lincoln, one of those things that's about a half a block long. And I remember thinking this thing had been twisted around. There wasn't a straight panel on it. It had been kissed on every side. All the windows were out except for the windshield. And there are these parking barriers, these concrete things you still see that they probably weigh 500 pounds a piece at least. There was one up against the windshield, underneath the windshield wipers. And all I could remember thinking when I looked at that is, I'd like to see that in slow motion. You know, God had to do that one himself, where he just pulled the wipers away and laid this thing. And it was the only thing that wasn't broken on the car, and it had this 500-pound piece of concrete laying up against it. So that was interesting, and went to electronics school after that and changed my whole life. So some good, some bad, I guess.
Did we get your name?
Russ Fisher.
Thanks, Russ. Okay. Do we have anybody? Okay.
My name's Muriel Reinitz. I worked at Tonka Toys at that time. I was on the day shift. But these poor women that lived out on the island and heard of this tornado going through, and there was no way they could get out there to see how their children were doing. And about midnight that night, one of the women called me and she said, 18 children were in a storm cellar. Some person put them in that storm cellar. And like Jerry said, they couldn't get out there to their families, and it really was heartbreaking. I don't think that Tonka Toys was aware, made their people aware of that storm, because they claimed they knew nothing about it.
Thank you. Oh. My exercise.
I'm Sherilyn Johnson, and my sister is Hazel Stadola. My brother-in-law was Don Stadola. I wasn't in the tornado, but this is what they told me. The day after I went out there, and there was a guard at the road, of course, but I guess he figured a woman with 2 small children could be safe enough. So I went in there, and Hazel was always afraid of storms. And Don and a couple of my nephews were watching the storm come across the lake, or not across the lake, but, from the other side. And she's trying to get them down the basement. They finally went down into the laundry room, and he had under a table, under a blanket, and heard, of course, it sounded like a train coming. When they went out, the laundry room window was the only window in the whole house that wasn't broken out, and they were not hurt at all. So they had a 4-level house. The bedrooms were totally gone. They couldn't find a stick of bedroom furniture, but my niece, digging around by the lake, happened to find my sister's old wedding rings and also one of Don's diamond rings. So that was very strange. The dog, they had a golden retriever that disappeared, and he came back about 3 days later limping, but he was, basically okay too. My sister and brother-in-law then put up a trailer and rebuilt on the same site. But it was a bad summer. My sister was very afraid living in that trailer of another tornado.
Thank you. These are all great stories. Do we have someone else that would like to volunteer? Okay.
Thank you. I'm Kathy Arndt, and at the time we lived over on Lafayette Bay near the Narrows Bridge. My husband was out of town. I was home with a brand new baby and 2 small children. And my mother-in-law had called, and we had just eaten dinner, the kids and I, and my mother-in-law called, and she said, Kathy, there's a tornado on the way. I was not listening to the radio, and I don't think we had siren warnings then at that time. I'm pretty sure we didn't. But I thought, I'm going to finish the dishes first. And then I got the kids. We went down to where our water pump was, which was all concrete. Our back stoop step was on top of it. And I put my baby in one of the girls' little doll beds, and we just sat down there with the radio and waited, and all of a sudden you could hear this train coming over the top of the house. And I was just scared to death. Well, fortunately, it passed over, but it went across to Carmen's Bay. Van Ness's house, I think the roof was taken off for sure, and there were a couple of other houses there. And we got through the evening okay. My husband was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and he made the trip home in about 3 hours. And when he walked into the house, he just sat down on the bench, and he was absolutely exhausted. Just the trauma. But even after the following days, the weeks, it was just awful. The kids would find things along the shoreline. There was a mink cape, ladies' gloves, all these little personal things that was so awful. And I often wondered if these people were, had died in the tornado. I'm assuming a lot of this debris came from Deep Haven probably. And then the house that blew into the lake on that sharp corner on 15. So with all of these pieces, and as the kids brought them up to the house, I couldn't throw them in the trash. I just laid them in the garage to dry out and thought, well, maybe someone might claim something, or, just a memento if nothing else. And I tried to get my girls to come today, and they were not, 2 of them are out of town. But when I saw this picture of Navarre out here it just brought everything back. And but as Judy had said, everyone in the whole community, and I think even Minneapolis, everyone just came out and just helped all of the people. Everything, it was just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got one other thought.
Sure.
Roger Lateral, who was on the fire department, lived right on the corner by the Island Park. And about 2 or 3 weeks after the tornado, he got a letter from Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and it had 3 or 4 of his canceled checks in it that had gone up there through the storm.
Okay. Anyone else have something they'd like to share with our group here? I heard stories about people finding fish up on high ground. Was that true? Is it true? Anything else unusual that? Anything else unusual that?
Thanks. I'm Pam Myers. I got to hear a lot of your stories today as you were coming in and looking at the photos. So I heard about someone standing, tell me who told me this story, somebody standing in the house looking out at the maple tree, and the maple tree was going around in a circle. Someone else told a story about a tree right outside that they saw the bird feeder go past more than once. But you have wonderful stories. Thank you for sharing them with us. Maybe you'll have another one come to mind.
Over here.
These are stories. One of them is an unhappy story. I'll start that way and then go to the positive. In my brother's wedding, there was one bridesmaid who lost her husband in this tornado because his VW was blown off the road into Lake Minnetonka. That's the unhappy part. The pleasant part is my cousin's wedding picture blew out of her in-laws' home because they lost all of the house and blew over into a friend's lake place 9 miles away, and the daughter said, "Oh, I recognize that girl." And so it went 9 miles across Lake Minnetonka. But these are just stories because it went over our house in Plymouth, but it lifted and only blew out some of the windows and things like that.
Thank you. Someone had mentioned earlier that some of the people that came out from Minneapolis were helpful, willing to pitch in. Were there some that were just kind of a pain coming out to just sightsee? Did that cause a big problem? There's a lot of that, huh?
They had to finally get the National Guard out.
The National Guard out to get it under control?
Get it under control.
Wow.
Our phones were out and we had friends lived in northeast Minneapolis, and their daughters lived in a trailer home in northeast of Minneapolis, out central, and he got in the car when he knew this tornado was going that way, and he got almost there with a car when he was blown off the road, and so he run out of the car and ran in, got her out of the house and brought her out in the field, and they laid down, her whole trailer went. And then they kept trying to call us out here. The only damage we had was on the roof of our house. And we were trying to call them because and their phones were all out there, but we knew what it had hit by the radio and that. But also, during the tornado, my husband sends my son and I down the basement so we would be safe. And I kept wondering where he was, so I came upstairs, and I'm looking out the window, seeing all the debris flying around in circles in the island, and John is standing in this big double-door garage with the door wide open watching it, and the minute it was over, he went into the island, and I didn't see him for hours afterwards.
Thank you.
You know, I think today you look at Navarre, and the people that weren't here then think it's, you know, a nice town. But the one thing that, you know, it's 40 years later that Navarre never really got rebuilt at all, because, like Jim said, the north side of the street really, they got affected and hit, but just light damage. The south side of the street, probably from where the liquor store is today on all the way up to Culver's, that was totally gone. And I think, you know, there's been none of that. There had to be, 12 businesses, 10 or 12 businesses in that area that were never, ever replaced. And then even that many years later, they stuck Rick's Super Value in their supermarket. And that's really the only one. So to those of us that were here then, it really has never, ever been replaced 40 years later. So.
Okay. Where else would like to go?
My family was out in Young America, and the tornado also went through there, and I'm sorry I'm late, so you may have already stated some of this, but I remember it was my brother's birthday, and back behind our house was a horse farm, and they had all sorts of very valuable horses, and the tornado went right through there, and horses that weren't killed, that were injured, had to be put down, and that's how my brother spent his birthday, helping with that.
Okay, do we have anyone else?
Well, my husband, Ron Grandine, was living on Edgewater Drive at the time, and he worked for the telephone company. He worked at the downtown office, and he was working the afternoon shift. And again, they knew it was a bad storm, so all the guys got up on the top of the building. Apparently, they had a penthouse kind of thing, and they watched it as it jumped around and as it happened. You know, they could just watch it.
Sure, no problem. All right, do we have anybody else that would like to share a memory? Oh. I'm going to go the other way around.
I'm Dorothy Hefty McQueen, and at the time I lived on Livingston Avenue in Navarre, just 2 blocks up from the dairy store. And I won't go into all that went on that night, but the scariest thing that I ever saw was when I looked out the back door and didn't see one light in Navarre. It used to be just full of lights down there, and it was just black, and I'll always remember that.
Jen Olson. We had moved out to this area about 1956, and I was teaching at Osseo at the time of when the tornado hit, and so I came driving out to Minnetrista. Just it was probably less than an hour before the tornado hit, and I remember I'll never forget the going around that curve. I never passed by the curve in Minnetonka Beach, having been being a garage sailor even then. I had been at a garage sale in that beautiful 2-door home that was on that bend that was totally wiped out in that tornado. But when I got home, we had a German Shepherd dog that was in the basement but was never allowed to come upstairs. That came upstairs and absolutely refused to go unless we came with him down into the basement. And the sky was green, and I remember, risk taker that I am, that running out when the hail hit, and there was baseball-size hail, and grabbed a couple of pieces to stick into the freezer. But the electricity was gone out, and saw the. So I turned on the radio to see what was going on, and of course it came across Halstead Bay, probably not more than a block or so south of our home. But we had debris that we picked out of our farm fields for months and even years after that. But we did not experience the damage or we're not able to see directly what in fact happened. But it's amazing how even the little things that you experience during times like that, you just never forget.
It's great. We've got a lot of people filling in the photos that are being passed around here this afternoon. A number of these photos were pulled from a book that was published in Excelsior shortly after the tornado occurred, and what was unusual about it is they didn't really have too many captions on any of the photos at all. So this is great to be able to record for posterity where exactly some of these photos were taken. Anybody else would like to? Okay.
Well, I'm sure that some of you remember the Orono Liquor Store. I worked part-time up there back in '65 for Dick Grant. And the story that I heard, and I wasn't working that evening, but if, a couple of the guys that worked there, what saved them, and I know what the next day when we went into the liquor store, you can imagine how much liquor and glass was spread all over the place. The barber shop that was next door to the liquor store had literally been picked up and just splattered against the side of the liquor store. Well, all the broken glass and the booze that was all over that place, what saved Andy, and I think there was I'm not sure if Andy was working alone and who the customer was, but what saved them was the cooler. They went in and locked themselves in the cooler, which is a pretty solid part of a liquor store, and that's what saved them.
Thank you, Dale. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. At the time of the tornado, Gene and I and our children were down in our basement underneath the stairs waiting till things kind of cleared up. Well, while the thing is still blowing out there, the fire sirens are going, and he had to leave. So here I am with 4 little kids, and we managed okay. But nobody has really mentioned the generosity of the people of Mount, how they came forward and brought hot dishes and bread and lunch meat and anything that we could possibly make sandwiches out of, so that we took them right out to the field and we fed the workers that were out there sawing and doing the cleanup. We fed them out there with sandwiches and coffee and whatever else we had donated. And we also set up a food station at the fire station, so that they could, people who didn't have any place to go to eat during that time came in and would eat at the fire station, all the workers and all the people. And the stores, everybody was so giving at that time.
Thank you very much. Okay. Kathy?
Kathy Rocknam. Tom and I were fairly newly married, maybe just under a year, and got the usual 75 blankets as wedding gifts, which I kept stored at my mom's house. And my brother, who was 9.5 years younger, was a Boy Scout, and they needed anything they could do to help these people that didn't have homes. And so, of course, he took the 75 blankets and handed them out, which was wonderful.
You mentioned the fish in the yard. Well, we had our own little tsunami, I think, because I imagine our house was maybe 50 feet back from the lake. But when that tornado came through and the bottom of the lake was exposed, the water would come all the way up to the house, all the way up to our lower level on the patio, and then it would go back. And we had a little aluminum boat, and it would just bob, and it just kept going. It was interesting just watching this lake go back and forth. One thing that wasn't mentioned, we talked about the electricity being off. That meant garage doors couldn't be opened if you had a garage door opener, and we had a double door. And it took a lot to try and get that door open so Ken could get his car out.
For those who lost power, how long did it take in those days to get it back on? 3 days? That was a long time. Long time without a refrigerator.
living on Livingston Avenue, I got power back on about 11, 12 o'clock that night. And my husband had come from work and went down to help in Navarre. And then he knew we had power, so he come up and asked me to make coffee. So I had a big coffee pot and made several pots of coffee that they took down to the workers down in Navarre.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to come around. Cord only goes so far. You bet.
Well, I live on the island. We didn't have any particular damage at our house, but we did end up, I think I was one of the first ones to feel the effect of the storm because we ended up with a corn stalk on our patio that came from across Cook's Bay. Anyway, I don't know where it came from. But we, another thing too, we didn't have any power, of course, and we had wells, and I had to go up and get some, a 6-pack of pop of Coke or something up in Mound to get something to drink. And I got back home, and I bet you there were 15, 20 people standing there. Ours was the only telephone that worked on the whole island, I think. And I couldn't even get in the house then. But we lucked out and didn't have any damage. I remember one thing, my daughter was going to go to work at A&W. And she got home, and she was all in a big rush, and I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I got to change clothes and go to work over at A&W. I said, "You're going right in the basement." I said, "Forget about the A&W." And that's where she ended up. But we didn't have any damage, thankfully. But it came right. We came up a hill like that and then over our house. And it left a corn stalk on the patio, so I guess that was our biggest indication of any damage. So we lucked out pretty much on that one.
This is Jack Wilson, thanks. Okay, really appreciate everybody that's contributing here today. Is there anyone else that would like to share a memory with us? I was a little young then. We moved out just a few months after the tornado into Minnetrista. But I had several friends that experienced it firsthand. One of my best friends lived on Dunwoody Avenue on Casco Point, and his home was a direct hit, completely demolished. And I'll never forget the story he told about. It was a split-level entrance, and they were running down to the basement to take cover. And his older sister, he said, was basically in midair, just being held by her hand. I believe it was his father or something was holding on to her, trying to pull her down the stairway. It was probably one of the most frightening stories that I've heard about it. Anybody else?
My name is Jim Regan. We lived out on Cedar Point at the time the tornado went by, and I lost my boathouse, my fish house, my 40-foot pontoon boat, and my whole seawall was gone when it went by. We did not have a basement. We had a crawl space in the house we lived in. That's where my wife and kids were, and the people next door who had no basement at all. And I laid on the living room floor watching it go by the front of the house. At the same time, I was a member of the JCs, and the JCs used to have a clothing drive. And we would take the clothes up to the White Earth Indian Reservation. In my garage, I had 67 bags of clothes to be taken up that weekend. Nevertheless, we took all the clothes down to the old Island Park City Hall and set it up for all the people that had lost clothes. I also worked for NSP at the time, and they used to have an appliance division. So we went over to Shorewood, and I think we got 9 or 10 refrigerators, 4 stoves, a couple other appliances, and brought them out there so that anybody that had lost everything could come into the Island Park City or Village Hall and pick up either the clothing or the appliances. When it was all over, 2 weeks later, I think we only had 30-some bags of clothing that we took up to the White Earth Indian Reservation. So,
thank you. Well, do we have anybody else that would like to?
I think if it hadn't have been for WCCO radio, I think there would have been deaths in the hundreds that day because they started real early, and I don't think a lot of people believed them, but they did start early, and because it did touch down, like she said, out in Hamburg and Norwood Young America, and then Waconia, or it was coming. They had a track, and so at least it did do that. And we did have 2 deaths here. I believe they had 12 deaths after the 2 joined, and it went up to Fridley. But I think in this area and here and Island Park and Navarre and all the way like through Cottagewood and Deep Haven, when you looked at the massive destruction after that, it was just amazing how there were only 2 deaths out of all of that. But 3 deaths, yeah. Okay.
Well, the one that we've been spending most of our time talking about today started near Norwood, Young America, and came up from the southwest, and then the other one started down by Chanhassen and took a more northerly track and then veered off towards the city, the north side of the cities. Kind of like a big trench that kind of pulls them through, and then I've heard about sitting up on the glacial moraine that Minnetonka seems to attract at least one major storm every 60 or 70 years like that. So kind of an unusual geography, I guess.
Maybe this would be a good time to mention the display at the Minnesota History Center on tornadoes. I haven't seen it, but it's supposed to be very intriguing and realistic with sound and motion. And I don't know how long it's open, but it's in the lower level of the History Center in St. Paul. And I'm sure it would talk about how they're formed, and they do mention this series of tornadoes particularly.
It may not have been mentioned, but my memory too is that was the year we had the blizzard on St. Patrick's Day. And then there was the floods. The Minnesota River really flooded. I went to Gustavus, that's where I was during the tornado, and that spring break we couldn't get home going the usual way. We had to take very circuitous routes to get back up to this community or out to Young America and then into the city. So it was a spring with lots of strange weather.
Anybody else? Okay. All right. Well, we'd really like to thank everyone for sharing your memories today and for helping us identify some of the photos that have been passed around. It's very important to preserve those types of things, and that's one of the things the West Tonka Historical Society, one of our main missions is to do that. If there's no one else that would like to, oh, certainly.
While they're talking about the Historical Society, these people put a lot of work into that display case out here, and they change it regularly. You should stop regularly and just admire the work that they do.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone that shared their personal accounts today and everyone else who attended. It was very interesting, and again, West Tonka Historical Society would like to thank everybody for today coming to attend our program.